In November of 1947, in the tall, echoing chamber of the United Nations General Assembly in New York, a roll call was taken that would change the history of the Middle East forever. Delegates from across the world, many of them representatives of new nations only recently freed from the grip of colonial rule, raised their hands to decide the fate of a small strip of land on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean. What they voted on that day became known as Resolution 181, the United Nations Partition Plan for Palestine. It was, in effect, a map that would attempt to draw clean lines across an ancient and deeply contested land. A map that promised two states, but ended up setting in motion a conflict that continues to define global politics more than 70 years later. To understand why such a map was needed, we need to step back to the decades before. After the First World War, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and Palestine, long a distant province of that empire, fell under the control of Britain. The League of Nations gave London a mandate, a word that disguised imperial power with the language of guardianship. Britain's promise, at least on paper, was to prepare the land for self-determination. But the Mandate era, stretching from 1920 to 1948, became a time of intensifying tension as two peoples came to see the same piece of land as their rightful homeland. For the Jewish people, battered by centuries of persecution in Europe, the dream of returning to Zion had long existed. In the late 19th century, that dream became political through the movement known as Zionism, which sought a national home for Jews in Palestine. During the Mandate years, Jewish immigration swelled, especially in the 1930s, as Hitler rose to power and anti-Semitism turned genocidal. By the end of the Second World War, hundreds of thousands of Jewish survivors, homeless and traumatized, pressed for entry into Palestine. For them, this land represented not only ancient roots, but also the only refuge in a world that had all but abandoned them. For the Arabs of Palestine, who formed the majority population, the same years brought mounting alarm. They watched as land sales and immigration threatened to turn them into a minority in their own country. The British, caught between promises made to Jews and to Arabs, tried to control the situation with commissions, restrictions, and police crackdowns, but violence often erupted. The Arab Revolt of 1936 to 39 was brutally suppressed, leaving wounds and resentments that lingered. By 1945, Britain was exhausted, bankrupt from war, and facing a Jewish insurgency that targeted British soldiers and officials in Palestine. The empire that had once boasted it would never see the sun set was now retreating across the globe. In London, leaders concluded that Palestine was a burden they no longer wished to bear. They handed the problem over to the new United Nations. The UN formed a special committee to recommend a solution. Its members traveled to Palestine in 1947, speaking with Jewish and Arab leaders, though the Arab Higher Committee refused to cooperate, unwilling to legitimize the process. What the committee produced was not a diplomatic compromise, but a partition. The land was to be divided into two states, one Jewish, one Arab, with Jerusalem placed under international administration. According to the map, the Jewish state would receive about 55% of the land, though Jews made up roughly a third of the population and owned far less than half the territory. The Arab state would receive about 45%. Jerusalem, holy to three faiths, would belong to neither. The vote at the United Nations on November 29th was tense, watched by millions through radio and newsreel. 33 nations voted in favor. 13 voted against. 10 abstained. The resolution passed. In the streets of Tel Aviv, Jewish crowds erupted into celebrations, dancing in circles, believing they were on the cusp of national rebirth. In Arab towns and villages, the reaction was one of shock and fury. For them, this was an international betrayal, a theft of their land without consent. The seeds of war had been sown. Almost immediately after the vote, violence broke out. What had been simmering tensions during the British Mandate now boiled over into open civil war between Jews and Arabs in Palestine. It began with snipers on roads, bombs placed in crowded markets, and ambushes in the dark. Convoys of supplies to isolated Jewish communities came under attack. Retaliation followed, carried out by armed Jewish militias. The lines between civilians and combatants blurred, and the fragile fabric of daily coexistence was torn apart. At the center of this conflict were the Jewish paramilitary organizations that had been preparing for this moment for years. The Haganah, the largest and most organized of them, now took on the role of defending the future state. More radical groups like the Irgun and Lehi embraced terror tactics, targeting Arab civilians as well as British forces. For the Arab side, irregular fighters, joined by volunteers from neighboring countries, launched raids and tried to choke Jewish transportation routes. By the early months of 1948, large-scale clashes were erupting across the land. The British, whose mandate technically remained in place until May of 1948, stood by uneasily. Their authority had collapsed in all but name, and their soldiers were preparing to withdraw. The empire that once prided itself on global order now looked like a caretaker packing its bags, waiting for the inevitable chaos to consume the land once it left. In London, ministers debated whether to intervene, but public opinion had turned against foreign entanglements. Palestine was no longer worth the cost. In Jewish communities, there was a sense of both elation and dread. On the one hand, the United Nations had recognized their right to a state. On the other hand, every day brought attacks and funerals. The Jewish Agency, the proto-government, worked feverishly to organize defenses, plan for independence, and secure arms from abroad. Many of the weapons came through secret shipments, smuggled past embargoes. Fighters trained in orchards and backyards, preparing for a war that seemed unavoidable. For Palestinians, the sense of betrayal was visceral. They had been the majority population in the land, yet now a foreign body had decreed that nearly half of it would be taken from them to create a state they had never consented to. Local leaders organized strikes and protests, but as violence escalated, many villages were drawn into the fighting. Unlike the Jewish side, which had centralized structures and international networks, the Palestinians were fragmented, divided by clan rivalries and weakened by years of repression under the British. This imbalance would prove decisive. As spring approached in 1948, battles grew larger and deadlier. In April came one of the most notorious episodes, the attack on the Arab village of Deir Yassin, carried out by the Irgun and Lehi militias. Over 100 villagers were killed. News of the massacre spread quickly, amplified by fear and rumor. For Palestinians, it became a symbol of existential threat. For Jewish forces, it was part of a brutal strategy to break resistance and secure territory. In the weeks that followed, panic spread through Arab communities, and many began to flee their homes. By May, the United Nations plan lay in tatters. Its carefully drawn borders existed only on paper, ignored by the violence on the ground. The British prepared to exit, and with them went the last remnants of formal authority. The stage was set for a decisive moment. On May 14, 1948, in a hall in Tel Aviv, David Ben-Gurion declared the independence of the State of Israel. Outside, crowds cheered, but in every direction, danger loomed. Within hours, armies from Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq were mobilizing. The first Arab-Israeli war was about to begin. The war that followed Israel's declaration of independence was fought on two levels at once: an international clash between the armies of the new state and its Arab neighbors, and a desperate struggle over villages, towns, and roads inside Palestine itself. For Israelis, it became known as the War of Independence. For Palestinians, it would be remembered as the Nakba, the catastrophe. On May 15, 1948, the day after the declaration, the armies of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq entered the former mandate. They declared they aimed to rescue Palestine from partition and to restore Arab rights. But their campaigns were hampered from the start by poor coordination, limited supplies, and mistrust among Arab leaders. King Abdullah of Transjordan had his own ambitions for the West Bank. Egypt sought influence in Gaza. Syria and Lebanon pressed from the north but lacked the strength to push far. The promise of a unified Arab front dissolved quickly in the dust of war. The Jewish forces, by contrast, though outnumbered and poorly equipped at first, were highly motivated and increasingly organized. The Haganah transformed into the Israel Defense Forces, bringing together thousands of fighters under a single command. Weapons trickled in from Czechoslovakia and elsewhere, giving the new state critical firepower. As weeks turned into months, Israeli troops moved from defense to offense, launching coordinated operations to secure territory and open supply lines. For civilians, the war was devastating. Arab villages found themselves in the path of advancing Israeli units. Some were evacuated at gunpoint. Others fled in fear after hearing of massacres like Deir Yassin. Entire communities vanished in days, their houses left standing but emptied of life. By the end of the war, an estimated 700,000 Palestinians had fled or been expelled, scattering into refugee camps in Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, and the Gaza Strip. Many believed they would return once the fighting ended, carrying keys to their houses as symbols of temporary absence. But the return never came. The Nakba was not a passing storm. It was the beginning of permanent exile. Inside Israel, Jewish refugees and survivors of the Holocaust streamed in, filling the towns and houses left behind. For them, the state represented redemption after near annihilation. For Palestinians, it represented dispossession. These twin experiences, triumph and catastrophe, became the foundational memories of two peoples, memories that still collide today. The fighting itself was brutal and uneven. In some places, Arab forces held their ground, as in the Battle for Jerusalem, where Jordan's Arab Legion captured the Old City and expelled its Jewish residents. In others, Israeli offensives swept through villages, leaving trails of refugees. The city of Lydda, for example, was emptied in July, its inhabitants forced to march in the heat without water. Survivors carried that memory as one of the darkest days of the war. By early 1949, armistice agreements were signed one by one, ending the war but not the conflict. Israel now controlled about 78% of the former mandate, more than the 55% allotted in the UN plan. The West Bank came under Jordanian control and the Gaza Strip under Egyptian administration. The Arab state envisioned by the partition map had never materialized. Instead, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians remained in limbo, stateless and scattered, while Israel consolidated its sovereignty and sought recognition from the world. For many outside observers, the war seemed to have solved one question while creating another. Israel had been born against overwhelming odds. But the fate of the Palestinians, the people whose homeland was divided and erased from the map, was unresolved. The refugee camps hardened into semi-permanent cities of exile. International agencies provided food and shelter, but no political solution. The 1947 map, once meant to be a blueprint for peace, now looked like the outline of a dream that had dissolved in smoke and blood. When the guns fell silent in 1949, the landscape of the Middle East had been remade. On the ground, the armistice agreements established a new geography. Israel held most of the land from the UN Partition Plan and more besides. The West Bank, with its rolling hills and ancient towns, was annexed by Jordan. The narrow coastal strip around Gaza, crowded with refugees, came under Egyptian control. The dream of a sovereign Palestinian state, promised on the map 2 years earlier, had vanished without ever being realized. Jerusalem, too, was divided. To the west lay the new Israeli capital, its government offices set up in hastily repurposed buildings, its neighborhoods filled with Jewish immigrants arriving in waves from Europe and the Middle East. To the east lay the Old City, controlled by Jordan, its ancient walls enclosing the holy sites of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. A no-man's land ran between, a scar of barbed wire and minefields through the heart of one of the world's most storied cities. For Palestinians, the war had shattered society. Hundreds of villages were erased from the map, some destroyed deliberately, others abandoned and resettled. Families that had tilled the same fields for centuries found themselves in makeshift tents in Lebanon or crowded quarters in Gaza, dependent on international aid. The UN created a special agency, UNRWA, to provide relief, imagining that the refugee crisis would last only months or years. Instead, generations would grow up in those camps, carrying the memory of a lost homeland like a torch. The bitterness of the Nakba sank deep. Palestinians spoke of betrayal not only by the international community, but also by Arab leaders, whose armies had promised liberation and delivered defeat. Trust frayed between ordinary people and their rulers, planting seeds of disillusionment that would bloom in later decades. Yet in the refugee camps, a sense of identity hardened, bound by the shared experience of exile and loss. On the Israeli side, triumph carried its own burdens. The young state now had to absorb waves of immigrants far larger than its original population. Survivors of the Holocaust arrived from Europe, still bearing the scars of trauma. Jews from Arab countries arrived as well, many fleeing hostility and expulsions triggered by the new conflict. Towns that had once been Arab were repopulated with Jewish families, often without acknowledgement of the people who had lived there before. The state celebrated resilience, but beneath the surface, contradictions grew. Internationally, the war froze the political landscape. The Arab world refused to recognize Israel, maintaining a stance of hostility and boycott. Israel, for its part, insisted that the refugee problem was the responsibility of the Arab states, not itself. The United Nations passed resolutions calling for the return of refugees or compensation, but they were ignored. Each side entrenched itself in narratives of justice and victimhood. The partition plan that had once been hailed as a path to peace was now little more than a memory. Yet its ghost lingered, shaping the way the conflict was understood. The idea of two states, Jewish and Arab, sharing the land side by side, never entirely disappeared. Decades later, in negotiations and peace talks, diplomats would dust off the concept, hoping to resurrect what the violence of 1948 had buried. Meanwhile, the physical borders drawn in 194, the so-called Green Line, became the lines of reference for the international community. Though never intended as permanent, they defined the map for nearly 2 decades, until another war redrew them again. Between Israel's independence and the unresolved question of Palestine lay a silence filled with bitterness, longing, and the weight of history. For both people, the events of 1947 and 1948 became foundational myths, repeated in textbooks, memorials, and family stories. Each remembered a different truth, yet both were bound to the same map that had once promised a future and instead delivered division. Looking back, it is difficult to see the 1947 partition map as anything other than a document of contradictions. On paper, it was a vision of compromise. 2 states for 2 peoples, international stewardship for a holy city, and a chance to bring peace to a land scarred by war and colonialism. In reality, it became a trigger, the spark that ignited a conflict already smoldering beneath the surface. Maps have power, but they are drawn on fragile ground when they do not reflect the consent of those who must live within their borders. For Israelis, the partition plan is remembered less as a roadmap to peace than as a step on the path to independence. The Jewish Agency's acceptance of the plan is seen as proof of pragmatism and willingness to compromise for the sake of survival. The joy that erupted in Tel Aviv on the night of the UN vote is preserved in photographs of dancing crowds and waving flags, images that stand in stark contrast to the violence that followed. To this day, the story of Israel's birth is told as a story of triumph over impossible odds, of a people finally returning to sovereignty after centuries of exile. For Palestinians, the memory is far darker. The same map is recalled as an injustice, drawn by outsiders with little regard for the people who had lived on the land for generations. To them, the partition plan was not a compromise but a dispossession, a decision to give away their fields and villages to strangers. The catastrophe that followed the Nakba is not remembered as an accident of war, but as the inevitable result of that betrayal. The keys to houses left behind, passed down through families in refugee camps, are not only symbols of personal loss, but of a national wound. The world, too, remains haunted by that map. The two-state solution, invoked in countless speeches and negotiations since, is in many ways the echo of Resolution 181. Each time diplomats return to the idea of partition, they are retracing the lines first sketched in 1947, as though hoping that by redrawing the map, they can undo the violence it unleashed. Yet the reality on the ground has grown only more complex. Decades of war, occupation, settlement, and shifting borders have made the neat lines of the UN plan seem almost naive. And yet, the partition map endures as a symbol. It represents both the possibility of coexistence and the tragedy of division. It is studied in classrooms, reproduced in textbooks, and argued over in courtrooms and conferences. Its lines, though never realized, are etched into the collective memory of the conflict. For some, it is a reminder of a chance missed. For others, a warning that peace imposed from above cannot last. What makes the story of this map so powerful is not only its political consequences, but its human weight. Behind the numbers and borders are the stories of families uprooted, of soldiers fighting for survival, of refugees waiting for a return that never came. The landscape itself bears witness. Empty villages overtaken by weeds, new cities rising where old ones once stood, cemeteries divided by borders, olive groves cut by fences. History here is not distant. It is inscribed into the soil. As the decades have passed, the map of 1947 has become less a plan and more a mirror. It reflects the hopes and fears of each generation, showing what was dreamed, what was lost, and what might still be possible. To study it is to confront the central paradox of Israel and Palestine, two peoples each with deep roots and legitimate claims bound to the same land and the same history, yet divided by lines that no map has ever been able to make permanent. And so the map that made Israel and Palestine remains with us, not as a settled blueprint, but as an open wound. It is a reminder of the dangers of easy solutions to ancient struggles, of the costs of ignoring voices in pursuit of expedience. But it is also a testament to the enduring human drive to imagine a future, to draw lines on paper in the hope of creating peace. Whether that hope will ever be realized remains uncertain. What is certain is that the legacy of 1947 will continue to shape the destiny of the region, as long as memory, loss, and longing endure.